Did Jesus Christ rise from the dead? Throughout the ages, skeptics have tried to prove the resurrection of Jesus Christ did not happen, but they were not successful. 4 different alternative theories to deny the resurrection have been suggested. The first is called the conspiracy theory. It says that the disciples stole the body of Jesus and lied about his appearances to them. They say the resurrection was a fake. This theory is not commonly believed by modern scholars because it ignores that the disciples believed in the resurrection. It is highly unlikely that many disciples would have been willing to die to support their lie. The scholar William Lane Craig writes, "If your favourite Messiah got himself crucified, then you either went home or else you got yourself a new Messiah. But the idea of stealing Jesus' corpse and saying that God had raised him from the dead is hardly one that would have entered the minds of the disciples." The second theory is called the apparent death theory. It says Jesus was not completely dead when he was removed from the cross. Once in the tomb, Jesus revived and escaped, thus convincing the disciples of his resurrection. It is very unlikely Jesus could survive crucifixion, and it does not make sense to think the Romans would not make sure he was dead. If he was alive in the tomb, how could a half-dead man get up, walk, move the huge stone that sealed the tomb, then overpower the Roman guards and get away? The third theory is called the wrong tomb theory. It suggests that the women lost their way to Jesus' tomb and came across the caretaker of an empty tomb. When the caretaker said, "Jesus is not here," the women were so confused they fled, and their story became the resurrection story. It is almost impossible that the women would have confused its location, and it does not explain the post-resurrection appearances. Also, the caretaker said, "He is not here, but is risen." You can find that in Luke chapter 24 and verse 6. The fourth theory is called the displaced body theory. It says Joseph of Arimathea placed Jesus' body in his own tomb, but later moved it to the criminal's graveyard. The disciples were not aware that Jesus' body had been moved and therefore wrongly thought that he had risen from the dead. Joseph would have corrected the disciples by showing them where he had moved the body of Jesus. It was against Jewish law to allow a body to be moved after it had already been buried. It also does not account for the post-resurrection appearances of Jesus. The notorious New Testament critic Bart Ehrman admits, "We can say with some confidence that some of his disciples claimed to have seen Jesus alive." New Testament scholar Paula Fredrickson, who is not a Christian, said, "I know in their own terms what they saw was the raised Jesus. That's what they say. And then all the historic evidence we have afterwards attest to their conviction that that's what they saw." I'm not saying that they really did see the raised Jesus. I wasn't there. I don't know what they saw. But I do know as a historian that they must have seen something. Fredrickson says the disciples and other followers were absolutely convinced that the crucified man Jesus appeared to them alive, raised from the dead. Virtually every Bible scholar across the Western world, regardless of religious background, agrees that Jesus' earliest followers believed he appeared to them alive. In 2 Corinthians chapter 11 and verses 23 to 33, Paul tells us he was beaten, imprisoned, stoned, starved, lost at sea, and daily in danger of all kinds of evil on his journeys throughout the Roman Empire. Why would anyone suffer this for what they knew was the lie? Even Paul said, if only for this life we have hope in Christ, we are of all people most to be pitied. And you can find that in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and verse 19. There is strong historical evidence that some important eyewitnesses were martyred for their faith. For example, Peter, James, and Paul. They all believed that what they saw was worth dying for. Here are 6 proofs that Jesus actually rose from the dead. Number 1, the resurrection was foretold by Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Number 2, the resurrection is the only reasonable explanation for his empty tomb. Number 3, it is the only reasonable explanation for the appearance of Jesus Christ to his disciples. Number 4, it is the only reasonable explanation for the beginning of the Christian church. Number 5, it is the only reasonable explanation for the transformation of the disciples. After the crucifixion, the disciples went into hiding in an upper room for fear of the Jews. You can find that in John chapter 20 and verse 19. They did not believe when the women first told them Jesus was resurrected. You can find that in Luke chapter 24 and verses 8 to 11. But after seeing and talking to the resurrected Jesus, they went out boldly preaching Jesus about 6 weeks later. And number 6, the witness of the Apostle Paul and the transformation of his life can be reasonably explained only because of the resurrection of Christ. Saul grew more and more powerful and baffled the Jews living in Damascus by proving that Jesus is the Christ. Acts 9 and verse 22. The chief priests and Pharisees remembered Jesus claimed he would rise from the dead on the 3rd day. So they asked for the tomb to be sealed and for a guard so the disciples could not steal Jesus' body and claim he was resurrected. You can read about this in Matthew chapter 27 and verses 62 to 66. The sealing of the tomb and the guard becomes a major proof that Jesus was really resurrected. The Jews did not deny the tomb was empty, but instead made up an explanation to deny the resurrection. The emptiness of the tomb is a widely attested historical fact. If the tomb was not empty, the Jews could easily have proved this by opening the tomb and showing everyone the body. The chief priests and Pharisees would have been better off to have left the tomb unguarded. It would have given their story more credibility. If only one guard fell asleep on duty, the entire guard unit was executed. When the body disappeared, the chief priests and Pharisees had to, embarrassingly, bribe the guards to say they all fell asleep, and then cover for them with Pilate and Herod so that they would not be executed. When Jesus appeared to the disciples in the upper room, at first the disciples were scared stiff as they thought it was a spirit. But if the disciples were going to make up a story about the resurrection of Jesus, it would have been easier to claim that Jesus came back as a spirit, as the existence of a body would be irrelevant. Jesus had 12 close followers who are often referred to as his disciples. One of these men, Judas, betrayed Jesus and later killed himself. The other 11 witnessed Jesus alive. 10 were eventually killed for testifying that Jesus lived, and the 11th was exiled and imprisoned. What would cause this group of scared and discouraged men to suddenly share the message of Jesus through the world? They continued even when their only choice was to renounce their message and admit it was a lie, or die. They chose death. The only explanation for such a change of attitude is that they totally believed they had witnessed Jesus alive and well after his crucifixion. Why would so many men die for something that they knew was a lie? But not one of them renounced their testimony throughout their lives. The only reasonable conclusion is that it is true. The truth is that Jesus is alive, and what that means was and still is worth dying for.